The Triumph TR7 is probably the most controversial sports car ever built. And this month at Manor Park Classics, we have this very late Solihull built example that was registered in August 1982, which is quite a chunk of time after this car went out of production, because the TR7 remains to me a little bit of an enigma. As I said, very controversial, but also quite successful. The degree to which depends on your school of thought. It depends on who you believe, the narratives you choose, and that all sounds very complicated for what was a fixture of 1970s Britain. But the TR7 is incredibly complicated in its gestation, in its engineering, in its final form, all because British Leyland were involved. This is complex in the greatest traditions of that company. So the TR7 really, in terms of its story, dates back to the early 1960s and to two, at the time, separate companies, MG and Triumph. This was before the British Leyland merger, when those two were individual companies and they were competitors. And to understand where they stood relative to each other, we need to look a little bit about how they marketed their cars, how they sold their cars, the prices they went for, and the kind of people that bought them. So MG are evergreens in terms of people's sports car brains. MG have only just launched their all-new electric Cyberster, which was the first MG sports car since 2011, and the first all-new MG sports car since 1995, and yet people still associate them so heavily with the concept of the sports car, because MG are one of the most successful sports car nameplates ever. MG created the MGB, which remains today in 2024 the most successful sports car of all time. Now, I know I'm going to get some comments about that statement. It is a strong statement at the end of the day, and people will be saying that Mazda MX-5 is more successful in terms of numbers, and as a nameplate that would be true, but the Mazda MX-5 is 4 separate cars. The MGB, on the other hand, is one car, produced for 18 years, and it remains, therefore, the most successful sports car of all time, in spite of the fact that it's been dead for 44 years. MG built everyman's sports cars. MG built cars like we know the Mazda MX-5 to be today. Cars that people could afford to get into, that people could afford to insure, to own, to fuel, to run, and to drive every day. Triumph, on the other hand, did things a little bit differently. Now, I've characterised Triumph before as kind of Britain's BMW. And the reason I've done that is because Triumph at the time engineered their cars in a distinctly premium way when that compact premium executive market didn't really exist. It could be said that Triumph really helped create that class, building cars like the 2000 with independent rear suspension, 6-cylinder engines and brilliant Michelotti styling. Triumphs were premium cars. They sat there or thereabouts where BMW do today. So think of the MGB as the Mazda MX-5, but view the Triumph TR4, TR5 or TR6 as the BMW Z4. They're both sports cars, yes, and they both kind of somewhat compete with each other, but realistically they do sit in different markets. And as if by magic, here we have an MGB. As I said, the most successful sports car of all time. And this one is very much a project, but with them being so successful, so well loved, and with such a great supply of aftermarket knowledge and brand new parts, this would be a really rewarding project for the winter. Anyway, sales pitch over, the MGB is the car that led directly to the TR7's development. So back in the early 1960s, before MG and Triumph merged into the same kind of holding pen, shall we say, that was British Leyland, MG introduced the B. This was 1962, and at the time, the MGB was a bit of a novel concept. You see, unlike the cars that came before it, this could be used every day. This car had a proper boot, it had proper locks, it had proper windows, and all of those things scream normal. Why wouldn't a car have proper locks and a boot and things like that? But sports cars at the end of the 1950s were very, very specialist. People kept sports cars in garages and only took them out at the weekends. The MGB was revolutionary because it enabled people to use sports cars every day. That's a big part of this car's success, but when BMC launched it, MG's parent company, they weren't so sure it was going to have a big shelf life. You see, this car is very traditional mechanically. It's rear-wheel drive, of course, and at the back it has a live axle, leaf springs, and it has lever arm dampers all round. And that means that in the context of early 1960s BMC passenger cars, your standard run-of-the-mill Austins and Morrises, this looked like yesterday's news. This was all thanks to a man named Alec Izagonis, who is famous for masterminding the Mini, the 1100 and the 1800, also known as the Land Crab. And those three cars brought us transverse engines and front-wheel drive, independent suspension all round, sprung by Hydrolastic, BMC's rubber and fluid suspension system designed by Dr. Alex Moulton. And those three cars were revolutionary in their own way. If this was revolutionary in terms of how people used cars, then those three Austins and Morrises were cars that revolutionized the entire motor industry. They led directly to the modern mechanical form of a standard passenger car. And as a result, it's understandable that BMC did not see that longer life in the MGB. And so from 1962, they were already working on a replacement by 1964. Their idea was to take the standard MGB body. After all, it was very good and it was essentially brand new, so why mess with a very successful formula? They took the body, they facelifted it, making it very delicate with the help of Pininfarina, and then took all of the antiquated mechanical components out of it. They kept it rear-wheel drive, of course, it's got to be a proper sports car, but the engine they fitted was the A-Series engine, all 1275cc's worth of it, from a Mini Cooper S. And while that's not as much power as an MGB, it could therefore replace both the MGB and the MG Midget with something lighter, smaller, and much rortier. It was more of a sports car engine than the very lumpy B-Series engine that was in these. But really, the headline act is the suspension, because yes, it remained rear-wheel drive, but it got independent suspension all round. Double wishbones at the front and at the rear. And that's very unusual in many, many production cars. Very few realistically have used double wishbones on all four corners, but it is the supreme form of vehicle suspension. It provides the geometry required to make a real, proper, true driver's car. And then, of course, they sprung it with Hydrolastic. This prototype, known as EX234, was loved by everyone who tested it, including that year's Formula One world champion, John Surtees. But the MGB was performing really very well indeed. And BMC, seeing the risk of putting this modern suspension and putting a very highly tuned engine in their very successful car, got a bit scared. They decided they didn't want to take the risk, and so they canned it. They decided to put it on the back burner and just keep the MGB rolling along. After all, they'd realised by this point that, oh, this new sports car, simple though it may be, all the usability features built into the body shell kept it competitive and made it more successful than BMC could ever have imagined. 4 years later, in 1968, is where the TR7 slowly starts to rear its head, because that's the year that BMC and Leyland merged to form the infamous British Leyland. And slowly but surely, over the next 5 years or so, MG and Triumph would merge from a day-to-day operations basis. They would essentially become one sports car manufacturer. But in the last few years of semi-independence under British Leyland, MG started working on another MGB replacement, this time known as ADO21. ADO21 was going to be a radical wedge-shaped body, much like the TR7 ended up having, but instead it was going to be mid-engine, driving the rear wheels using the engine and gearbox from the then essentially brand new Austin Maxi, again with hydroelastic suspension. This time, however, British Leyland said no because they absolutely did not have the money to engineer something so radical. And again, they didn't want to take the risk of alienating their market, especially in the United States, where MG and Triumph collectively had essentially a monopoly over the market. That also existed in the UK as well, but the American market was larger, the American market was more conservative, and so they put the brakes on it again. AD021 was canned, and British Leyland sent a team of executives over to the US to figure out what they wanted from a sports car. As I mentioned earlier, the MG marque sold more cars, but because of Triumph's greater reputation, because of Triumph's greater image, they decided that this new corporate single sports car needed to have a Triumph badge. They decided it wasn't going to be radical and it needed acceptable conventional suspension, front engine and rear wheel drive. The recipe had therefore been set for what became the Triumph TR7, but you'll notice that we've not really talked about any contemporary Triumph sports cars, and that's because in this story it's often forgotten, but they don't overly matter. You see, at this point Triumph were building the Spitfire and the GT6. They're two little tiny sports cars, one of which had a big straight six engine, but that didn't sell in as great numbers and were not as well regarded either as the equivalent MG Midget or MGB. Then the step up from that, you had the Triumph TR6, which had been in production for a few years and was already an icon in its own right. It sold in respectable numbers, but it didn't sell in huge numbers because it was a relatively expensive car. People were much more willing to buy MGBs because they were affordable. For the very same reason today that so many people buy Mazda MX-5s, it's because it sits in a different market segment to the likes of a BMW Z4, a more accessible, more affordable market segment. And so, if British Leyland were going to replace all of their sports cars with one car, then it wasn't going to be a Triumph TR6 replacement. It wasn't going to be a Triumph Stag replacement or a Triumph Spitfire replacement. It wasn't even going to be an MG Midget replacement. It was going to be an MGB replacement. And this is the immediate hurdle which so many people, when considering the TR7, forget. Of course, that is the fault of British Leyland, but the TR7 was not really a replacement for the TR6. It was a replacement for the MGB. So while the TR6 had independent rear suspension and a nice 2.5 litre fuel-injected straight six, the TR7 made do with a live axle, and it made do with a carburettor-fed 4-cylinder 2-litre engine, producing 45 brake horsepower or so less than the UK spec petrol injection TR6. So when this car launched in the mid-1970s, 74 in the US, 76 in the UK, people saw the badges on this car and were immediately disappointed by it. They thought it was an affront to the TR nameplate, but if it just had MG badges instead, or it was badged as a Triumph Spitfire instead, people might have been much more welcoming of it from a mechanical engineering standpoint. That mechanical package, as I've just mentioned, is a live axle at the rear. Rear-wheel drive with a front engine, of course, but it has coil springs and it has telescopic shock absorbers all around. Nothing even all that interesting, but it is a serious move up in the world from the old MGB. This was a much more modern car while retaining that sense of simplicity that BL's market planners so dearly wanted from their new, hopefully massive success in the United States. The rear suspension of this car is very similar to that used in the Triumph Dolomite and later in the Rover SD1, which means that it wasn't very un-Triumph-like, it just wasn't like an old TR6. It was actually engineered by Spen King, who is the man that came up with the Range Rover. Spen King knew his stuff, but he also knew that simplicity was required. So he engineered this live axle system for this new generation of Triumphs and of Rovers, because that's what British Leyland required. Something affordable, something simple to hopefully stave off bankruptcy. It was then clothed in this ridiculous concept car-like wedge shape, which was done by Harris Mann. Harris Mann was chief stylist at Austin Morris, the old MG side of British Leyland, which means that this car was a corporate sports car. It wasn't a proper Triumph, and it wasn't a proper MG either. It really did sit in the middle. Style by MG, engineering by Triumph. Of course, that made nobody particularly happy, but it was what was necessary at the time. And engine-wise, it uses Triumph Slant 4, which was introduced at the end of the 1960s and was used in four-cylinder form in the Triumph Dolomite, of course, and it was also used in V8 form in the Stag. This engine was later used, it was built under license and then re-engineered by Saab. This is essentially the basic starting point of an engine for the Saab 900 Turbo. So all this in mind, the step up this car was from the MGB, the radical, brand new style, the comfortable, sensible engineering, it sounds like this car should have been a success. So where did it all go wrong? Well, first of all, the style is a big part of that. Compared to the very pretty MGB and the very classic looking Triumph TR6, this was just new. This was novel. This was the kind of car that 5-year-olds in 1975 would look at, gawp at, celebrate, and have little models of and think it looked so cool on a street corner. But those of us who were a little bit older in the mid-1970s, the people who were actually buying the car didn't take so kindly to it. A lot of people thought this car was very, very ugly. People didn't like the shape of the pop-up headlamps at the front. They didn't like the fussiness of the vents in the bonnet and the bulge. They didn't like the big swage line that goes up towards the rear, and they didn't like the quite nondescript, very concept car rear end. Now, I blow hot and cold on the TR7 styling. It is a naturally controversial shape, something so different to everything that came before, but that's what Harris Mann did. Harris Mann did mad, radical shapes, and this is what MG wanted all along from a stylistic perspective. They wanted something that looked new, that in the same way as the MGB did in 1962, took MG from a stylistic perspective, from a usability, from a perception perspective, into another league again. But beside the styling and beside the nameplate, quality was another thing that always hampered these cars. British Leyland are not known for the greatest quality, and in 1975, between the car's US and UK launches, British Leyland went bankrupt. They were bailed out by the UK government, who essentially nationalised the company. Too big they were to go under, with Britain in such a perilous economic position themselves, that such a huge employer, the merger of Britain's two leading car companies going bust, would have been disastrous for the entire country's economy. And so the TR7 was saved along with the rest of the British Leyland Empire and was slowly reformed over the coming years. The likes of the Triumph Stag and the Triumph TR6 were killed off really to make way for the TR7. But strangely, BL kept producing the MGB. They kept producing the MG Midget, and they kept producing the Triumph Spitfire. When stories of the TR7's lack of reliability, its dreadful build quality started to come through, people were turned off by it even more than they were about the styling and about the nameplate. This was an affordable, comfortable, usable sports car that was very modern to look at, but people kept buying the old car because they trusted it. All the way through to 1980, when the MGB was finally killed off, it sold in greater numbers than the new TR7. From good bones, it appears that BL had mucked it up. They'd not taken quite the right directions, and by giving it such a confusing, gestation period by giving it such a confusing name and a confusing style. People didn't know whether they wanted it or not, so they kept buying the B instead. The TR7 ended up only living for 6 full years. It was killed off in 1981 after going through 3 production plants during its life. This car, from that perspective, therefore, was deeply, deeply unsuccessful. But from a different perspective, this car was very successful. If we take it by virtue of its nameplate and say, okay, it didn't have a 6-cylinder engine and it didn't have independent rear suspension, therefore it's a disappointment. But from a sales perspective, this enormously outsold the old TR6. If we view it beside the MGB, as I said, the car it really replaced, then it was a failure. But that's how we can create a narrative around this car that is very confusing. There is no one prevailing narrative. This car was either the most successful TR ever built, or it was a failure compared to the MGB. Which one? Because we can't really have both. If this car was an MGB replacement, then it doesn't deserve to have the TR badge. It's just a confusing car to behold. This is a big part of why I find British Leyland cars so interesting, because they have these confusing backstories that never seem to make sense on the surface. You've got to really look and think about them before you can make sense of them. So let's try and make sense of what we think about the TR7 by going for a little drive. So in our 70s excellence of the Triumph TR7, we find ourselves in the next part of how they designed the car. What was interesting about it, what was different, and why people maybe weren't so enamored by it, or alternatively were. So if this car was an MGB replacement, then let's think about what the MGB did so well. And that's refinement, that's usability. And so this car was designed not to feel necessarily like a sports car on a day-to-day basis. It was instead designed to feel like a low-slung saloon car. And so in this car, I have space. I'm very, very comfortable. I have these nice, comfortable seats. I have this great driving position, and I have elbow room. You didn't get any of those things in an MGB. And also, of course, I have a 5-speed gearbox because this is a later car. But that meant that as soon as you get in one of these, it doesn't feel like an out-and-out sports car. There is a weightiness to the controls. It feels like a sports car in terms of its heft, but in terms of its space and its ease of use, it doesn't feel like a sports car. And so again, it confused people. People weren't sure what to make of it. And then there's the fact that, as I said, the quality wasn't all that great, and that does show up in a few design points of the interior, for example, where these seats are great, and I love the checkered pattern in them. But look at the dashboard. This was the era when plastic dashboards were first coming in, and there were exposed screw heads everywhere. Compared to the likes of even Lancia or Alfa Romeo even, this plastic interior just doesn't scream quality. So there's always something positive and something negative to counteract it. It's just such a confusing car. So in front of me, I have that slant 4 engine, all 2 litres of it with 104 brake horsepower. And it feels very hearty, but it's not that refined. It doesn't have the refinement of the old B series engine. But it is full of torque, and with an overhead camshaft, it's a much more modern engine. But again, this engine then eventually got a reputation for unreliability. It got a reputation for popping head gaskets, which just isn't great at all. From a driving perspective, this thing is perfectly competent. When you start pushing it, you realise that it has got an ability. Remember, the Triumph Dolomite and the Rover SD1 were always considered to be great cars to drive. And this is no different, but it just doesn't have the edge of the sports cars it replaced. It has that level of refinement. And so, as a result, again, it's quite a confusing car. I would absolutely consider that you should come and have a look at these cars for yourself and really do some research on them and figure out where you sit in these discussions. Because even 50 years on, we're still not all sure what we all think of this car. You know, is it an affront to the TR badge? Is it a saloon car with sports car style? Or is it an MGB replacement? Which is it? We just don't know. The overarching thing about this car, however, is that I feel very, very cool sat here. This is a wedge-shaped 1970s British sports car, and that's fantastic. People bought these cars because they, maybe didn't need the back seats, they didn't need the extras of a saloon car, and the ability to have something like this is just unparalleled. Again, this opened the door to a different kind of motoring. So if you are interested, then do follow the link in the description and come and have a look at this thing for yourself.